All right, on this video, I'm going to be talking about buying houses subject to the existing mortgage. Okay, buying houses sub to, right? You're buying houses subject to the existing mortgage, or some people like to abbreviate and call it sub to. And essentially what it means is you're buying a house where the seller is agreeing that you will simply take over their mortgage payments and assume their mortgage. So if the house is worth $200,000 and they have a $150,000 mortgage balance, and you said, I'll give you $50,000 and I'll just take over the $150,000 mortgage balance and I will continue to make the payments to the bank, that's what sub to is, all right? Now, before I get into the details of this, a couple of key points. Number one, I'm not an attorney and this is not to be construed as legal advice. So I highly recommend that if you want to utilize a strategy that you do consult with a licensed attorney in your state. I recommend that for the specific closing I'm just going to talk about right now, that you actually do the closing with the help of an attorney, because that will come in handy as we go through the process. All right, so buying houses subject to the existing mortgage is pretty straightforward. You'd like to sell your house, it's worth $200, you owe $150 to the bank. Someone else comes in and says, listen, I'll give you 50 grand cash, I'll just take over the mortgage of $150. The question is, well, why would I do that? And why would you do that? All right, so let's go through those two scenarios. Why would I do that? Because you have a 2.875% mortgage and you've got 25 years left on a 30-year mortgage, and I think that's a pretty good interest rate. I don't have to deal with approvals and points and fees and everything else. I just step in to that payment. So if you're an investor or buyer, one of the key things you want to understand is how much do you owe to the bank? $150,000. How long is left on your mortgage? 25 years. What's your monthly payment? And does that include taxes and insurance? In other words, what's your monthly payment, including principal, interest, taxes, and insurance? And you need to make sure you understand the mortgage. Is it a 30-year mortgage? Is it fixed? Is it variable? Is it a 15-year mortgage, right? So make sure you're looking for fixed rate mortgages, and the less term left, the better, and the lower the interest rate, the better. And make sure when they tell you what their payment is, that you understand if they're escrowing for taxes and insurance, if that's included in the payment. What you're looking for is scenarios where their payment is lower than what you can rent the house for. So as an example, if their payment was $1,500 a month and you can rent the house for $2,200 a month, then you would have positive cash flow, because you'd simply take over their payment, continue paying the bank $1,500, rent the house out for $2,200 and put that other $700 in your pocket. So that's why you would do it. The question is, well, why would the seller do it? So the answer is because a seller's trying to sell their house and they cannot get an offer. So one common scenario I see is, let's say they're trying to sell their house for $200 and they got an offer at $170. And after factoring in the closing costs and the commissions, they look and see, wow, I'm not going to net $150, I'm going to net less than that. And they have to come to the table with money, right? So that's one scenario they don't like. The other scenario is they don't want to take a $170 offer, they prefer to take Lex's $200 offer. And Lex is willing to buy that house at market value because there's financing in place. So they get a higher amount, which is why they would be willing to do it, all right? So those are the two scenarios, different viewpoints from the viewpoint of the investor or the buyer and the viewpoint of the seller, all right? So now the question is, well, how do you actually do this, and is this legal? So that's a good question. And once again, this is not legal advice, but basically when you have mortgages, most mortgages have what's called a due on sale clause. And a due on sale clause says that if the property is transferred or conveyed, then, in other words, if it switches ownership, then the mortgage that's on that property, in other words, the $150,000, becomes due and payable within 30 days, all right? And that's what scares off a lot of people from wanting to do a buying a house subject to. But the reality is, if you look at the due on sale clause, all right, it's not ironclad, and I'll tell you why. There's a couple of reasons. Reason number one, some properties don't even have a due on sale clause and are assumable. For example, U.S. Department of Agriculture loans, any federal savings bank loan pretty much, and also VA loans, right? So if you have a VA loan, you can assume it and that's no problem. But let's say it's not any of those and it is actually a regular bank that has a due on sale in their mortgage clause, all right? So how do you get around that? So there's a little known act that came out in 1982 that Reagan signed off on, and it's called the Gone-Saint Germain Act. And the Gone-Saint Germain Depository Act had a little clause in there where it spoke about the due on sale clause, and it spoke about how the due on sale clause works, the prohibition of due on sale clause, but it also speaks in that act as to what are exceptions to the due on sale clause. And there are some exceptions, and those exceptions notably are, number one, if there's a divorce, for example, if a husband and a wife get divorced and the wife is going to stay in the house and she's going to keep the house, then you're allowed to transfer the property from the husband and wife's name to just the wife's name, and that does not trigger the due on sale clause. That's one exception. Another exception is if someone dies. So let's say the parent dies, they want to leave the property to their spouse, or they want to leave the property to their child or anyone that they name as an heir. That also does not trigger a due on sale clause, because imagine if every time a parent died and the child inherited the house, it triggered a due on sale clause. It would be, chaotic to say the least, right? So basically that's another exemption. And there's a couple of other exemptions that are very weird legalese, like for example, if there's a lien on the property is one exemption. But the one that we're going to utilize is in the terms of this St. Germain Act. It basically says if the property is transferred into an inter vivus trust. And there's a type of inter vivus trust called a land trust. And a land trust is a vehicle that's very commonly used. I use it in almost every rental property that I own, that allows somebody to take title to a property where people cannot see who the trustee or who the beneficiary of the property is, right? So I don't want someone to be able to go to the property appraiser website and see how many properties I own. So if I own 1,500 rentals, I don't want you to see the address of all of those properties. I want it to be anonymous. So one way I can do that is by putting the property in a land trust, right? So land trust is a perfectly valid legal vehicle that's utilized by many people, including myself. And a lot of times what people do is they'll put a land trust and the beneficiary might be their living trust, or it might be an offshore entity, or whatever it might be, right? So you can utilize that too by transferring the property from the seller into a trust. And the way that you do this, and once again, I recommend you do this with an attorney and don't do this yourself. Find an attorney and tell them, I have a seller who wants to sell the property, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be transferring the property into a land trust so we don't trigger the due on sale clause, and then have the closing at the attorney's office and have the attorney prepare the paperwork for you. And that's going to become a lot of benefit, because if you ever have a problem down the road, that attorney will be able to assist you with it, right? So don't go alone on this strategy. Make sure you use an attorney. So basically the way it works, parameters of how it works, and there's programs out there where they'll charge you $10,000 to see the information I'm going to give you right now for free. All right, so step one, you're going to take the property, transfer it from the seller into a land trust. All right, step two, the trustee of the land trust is going to be the seller, and the beneficiary of the land trust is going to be the seller. But the successor trustee of the land trust is going to be you, or your entity, or your company, all right? It could even be your trust, all right? Now, that's step one. Step two is the seller is going to resign as trustee. Successor trustee, being you, is going to step in, and the seller is also going to resign as beneficiary. Now, what's great about a land trust is that land trusts are not recorded documents, all right? So what that means is I can buy a property in a land trust, and you or anyone else on the planet cannot see who the beneficiary of that property is, all right? And you cannot even see who the trustee of that property is. And you certainly can't see who the successor trustee of the property is. So that is how you can use this inter vivus trust language and allow yourself to essentially buy a property and assume the mortgage, right? So seller transfers to a trust, and then the trust essentially becomes taken over by you. And you simply keep making those payments. So if it's $150,000 mortgage, you just keep making those payments and you're good to go. So one thing that triggers people, all right, in a due on sale clause situation, what trips up 90% of people is the insurance. And what do I mean? Seller sold the house to you. She calls up her insurance agent. She cancels the insurance policy. The lender who has the mortgage on that $150 gets a letter saying, hey, watch out, you have a loan here and there's no insurance on the property. Then the lender goes and looks at the property and sees that the title has been transferred. Now you got a big problem. They come to you and say, hey, the money's due in 30 days. So what you need to do instead is keep the insurance in place that's originally there, and simply call up the insurance agent and add the land trust as an additional insurance. Say, my attorney advised me to move my property into a trust for asset protection purposes, and so I need to have the trust be listed as an additional insured. And then you simply log into the portal and continue making the insurance payments. All right. Now, once again, not to be construed as legal advice. You need to consult with your attorney as to the legality of the strategy in your state and whether or not this is or is not legal. I'm simply telling you how investors do it. All right. And another thing as well is a lot of people are afraid of the due on sale clause. Well, let me tell you a funny story. My first property that I found for my mentor, Ben, was actually a wholesaler, had 3 houses under contract in Port St. Lucie, Florida. And I found the houses from a classified ad, and my mentor agreed to buy these 3 houses. And originally came from a wholesaler who had a deposit up, and he wanted us to pay the deposit. And we stepped in and we closed. And that seller, on my first deal ever, called the bank and said, these guys bought the property and they'd taken over the mortgage. To cut a long story short, they contacted us. We agreed to assume the mortgage. They sent us some documents with a whole bunch of fees and points. We said, we're not signing this. If you want us to assume it, send it again with no points and fees. A week later, they agreed to do that, and we assumed the mortgage, right? So do not be afraid of the due on sale clause, all right? That's the worst that could happen. The worst that could happen is they came and said it's due, and you could pretty much find another private lender to step in there and do that, right? But do consult with your attorney if you're going to utilize a strategy. I see a lot of people out there, a lot of programs, real estate courses, etc., out there where they're kind of telling people how the strategy works, but they're not digging into all the details and the legalities of what could go wrong. And that's why you want to have an attorney, so that the attorney is handling the closing and having the seller sign sufficient documentation to protect you and doing it the right way. All right, guys? So the strategy of buying houses subject to is a very valuable strategy. Definitely something you can utilize, especially in today's market, because if rates have moved from 3% to 8%, it would be great if you could step in and take over someone's 3% mortgage payment, because you certainly can't get that from lenders today, right? So buying houses subject to, awesome strategy. Make sure you use it. If you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you have any questions or comments on this video, feel free to use the comment section below. And otherwise, hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys on our next video.